Hey guys, let's get right into this with Chapter 5, Video 5, The Long Decline. So, after ruling the Mediterranean for hundreds of years, Rome's power eventually started to crumble for a number of reasons. You had threats from the outside as well as the inside. So, in this video, we're going to learn about the long decline. There's an old saying that Rome wasn't built in a day. Well, it didn't fall apart in a day either. This is why we call this the long decline. Rome's problems lingered for decades, in some cases even centuries, before things finally collapsed. Things first start to look bad when the Pax Romana ended. There we are. Remember that the Pax Romana, meaning Roman peace, was a period of almost 200 years of Roman stability. So the first 200 years of the Roman Empire, things were fairly stable and prosperous. It ended, though, after the death of Marcus Aurelius, and when it ended, you start to have things like political violence. Now, during this period, a really disruptive pattern emerged where the overthrow of emperors became common. Because the Romans never really liked the idea of a true monarchy, it was never set in stone that the next emperor had to be the son of the current emperor. It always made the line of succession a little tricky, like who's going to be the next emperor. During this period, it got downright crazy, though. A lot of guys who claimed the throne only lasted a few years, some only a few months. A lot of people were taken out the old-fashioned way as well. In one period of 50 years, you had 26 different emperors, and only one of them died of natural causes. The rest were either killed or driven from power. Not good if you're trying to create a stable government. Now, besides political problems, there were also significant social and economic problems. The biggest was high taxes. These high taxes were used to support the huge army and all the government positions. Small businesses and farmers had to shoulder the burden of this. In addition to rising taxes, you also had rapid inflation. Prices soared quickly, making it very tough for small businesses and farmers. Also, similar to what we talked about towards the end of the Roman Republic, there was an over-reliance on slave labor. Wealthy landowners used slaves, and small farmers couldn't afford them. So between competing with the wealthy farmers and being overtaxed, many small farmers went out of business and were forced to work for the wealthy or travel to Rome and live in poverty. This saw a significant decline in the middle class, resulting in a growing gap between the rich and poor. The rich got richer, while the number of poor Romans increased significantly. In order to deal with all of these problems, some pretty radical changes were taken. Namely, the Roman Empire was divided. In 284, the Emperor Diocletian comes to power. Now, Diocletian needed to figure out how the empire could be governed more efficiently. He decided in this year to divide it in two. He divided it into a west and an east. Get me out of the way here. Okay, so it was literally split in two. Right? You got a Western Empire and you've got an Eastern Empire. There we are. By dividing it, he made another guy, Maximian, a co-emperor. Right, so this actually was a time where you had two emperors. Diocletian kept the eastern part, right? So he moved into this purple area and he gave Maximian the kind of yellowish orange part, the Western Empire over here. Now you might wonder why Diocletian would take the eastern half, since you look, here's Rome. Rome is in the western half. So it's like, all right, he gave up Rome. That seems kind of odd. This is because by this point in history, the eastern part of the empire was much more wealthy and stable than the western. Most of the trade in Roman territory came through the eastern Mediterranean in that part of the world. All right. A couple of decades later, Emperor Constantine took things a step further. Now, we already learned about Constantine. He was the emperor who officially ended persecution of Christians, right? In the law here, he said that, I saw a vision of the cross on a battlefield and his mother was a Christian. So he said no more torturing or beating up on Christians anymore. But he also, so that's one of the big things that you got to know about Constantine. The other big thing was that he made a new capital. And he chose the old Greek city of Byzantium and he renamed it Constantinople, right? So here's Constantinople here. So now you've got two empires, two emperors, and two capitals, Rome and Constantinople. He obviously named it after himself in his honor. This new Rome, as it was called, quickly became the wealthiest city in the empire. Now, the reforms of both of these emperors were temporary. The economy was temporarily revived, but the long-term decline wasn't stopped. The internal problems were now being made worse by invasions from the outside. Rome had faced attacks from outside peoples for centuries, but they always managed to withstand them. This was different, though. Rome wasn't in the same position of power as it once was, and added a new enemy in the Huns. The Huns were a nomadic people from Central Asia, very fierce fighters, very, very effective on horseback. And they started to migrate into Europe around the year 370 or so. They were led by this guy Attila. Attila was their fearsome commander. Attila was so feared by the Romans that they referred to him as the scourge of God. They believed that God had sent him to punish them for all of their sins. And as the Huns pushed into Roman territory, they set off what we call a domino effect. Now, what happens when you knock over one domino? All the others start to fall. So we refer to this as a domino effect because the Huns pushed all these other Germanic groups out of their homelands and into Roman territory. Right? So you see the green line here. This is the Huns. Shouldn't have crossed it out. I meant to circle it, but you guys get the idea. And as they come into contact with all these other groups, the Visigoths, the Goths, the Vandals, and so forth, they go spilling into what was left of Roman territory. All right. So the Huns destabilize almost the entire continent of Europe. Now, in years past, this would not have really worked, but it was much more effective now because the Roman legions were not up to the task of holding the line. They lacked the discipline and training of earlier Roman armies, and Roman power was fading. The old citizen soldiers were now giving way to foreign mercenaries. With few actual Romans volunteering for military service, Romans had to rely on people from the outer provinces to fight for them. And these mercenaries didn't fight for the glory of Rome. They fought for a paycheck. When push came to shove, they were not a good enough defense against the invasions. Now, these Germanic groups that were being pushed into Roman territory by the Huns were now winning fights against Roman legions, something that would have been unheard of a few hundred years prior. So between the Huns invasions, between the Germanic invasions, Rome itself was in serious trouble. And in the year 476, the last Western emperor, move me out of the way, was ousted. You can kind of see it on the bottom. Romulus Augustulus, surrenders to Odoacer. Okay, Odoacer was this Visigoth general on the horse there, and then you have Romulus Augustus right here, the last of the Roman emperors surrendering. Now, this is often referred to as the quote-unquote fall of Rome, but this is misleading for a couple of reasons. Right? It brings us to the question: did Rome fall? All right, the short answer to this is not really. Even though the Western Emperor was ousted in 476, the Eastern Empire continued on for centuries. We refer to this empire as the Byzantine Empire. Let me move me here. Okay, so this all over here, let me do that, but this all over here is done in 476. This over here is going to chug along and do just fine for itself for close to 1,000 more years. All right. It had some significant cultural differences from the old Roman Empire, but they still consider themselves Roman. We'll learn more about that in a later chapter. Even in Western Europe, though, Rome survived in a number of ways, such as language. All right, I didn't mean to put it up that quickly, but you can see that there. Latin, right? Latin survived as a language of the Catholic Church, and it evolved into several other languages called the Romance languages. Languages such as Spanish, French, you got all the different Italian ones, Romanian, okay? So Latin still kind of exists in different forms even to this day. Also, Roman law. We talked about that a lot throughout this chapter, most recently at the end of video number 3. We still have aspects of Roman law in our own American laws today. So while the Western Roman Empire officially ended in 476, the legacy of Roman civilization is going to endure for many years and still does so in many ways even today. So that wraps things up for this section on the quote-unquote fall of Rome, and it also wraps things up for chapter number 5.